Welcome to What Your GP Doesn't Tell You, the podcast for both doctors and patients with me, Liz Tucker. In this week's episode, I'm going to be talking to psychiatrist Professor Joanna Moncrieff about her new book, Chemical Imbalance, The Making and the Unmaking of the Serotonin Myth, published by Flint Books. I first spoke to Joanna 2 years ago, just after she'd published a review paper suggesting that there was no link between depression and an imbalance of serotonin in the brain, and her book really picks up what happened next. As her article gained more and more attention, she found herself in a political maelstrom, facing vitriolic personal and professional criticism. Because if the serotonin hypothesis was false, what would be the grounds for prescribing the popular antidepressants, the SSRIs or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, that has been claimed in the past can alter brain chemistry and correct this imbalance of serotonin if no imbalance exists? What followed illustrates the fierce political divide in psychiatry between those who remain sceptical of Joanna's claims and believe that the current medication for depression is a vital tool, and those such as Joanna who query its value. And we also discuss why, much to her surprise, as someone who's always been a socialist, Joanna found much more sympathy for her research from right-wing media sources rather than left-wing ones. But before we get to Joanna's interview, a brief request from me. If you enjoy this podcast and would like to leave a review on Spotify or Apple, that would be much appreciated. It really helps. You can also become a paid supporter of the podcast at patreon.com/whatyourgpdoesn'ttellyu or via PayPal on my website, whatyourgpdoesn'ttellyu.com. A huge amount of work goes into both the research and production of this podcast, so even a small amount of money makes a huge difference. And you can find out more information about the pod on my website, where you can sign up for the podcast mailing list, follow me on Twitter at Liz C. Tucker, and on my Substack account, liz.tucker.substack.com. Many thanks. And now back to Joanna's interview. Professor Joanna Moncrieff is a practicing psychiatrist and a professor of critical and social psychiatry at University College London. She's also a founder member and co-chair of the Critical Psychiatry Network, a group of psychiatrists sceptical of the idea that mental disorders are simply brain diseases. Here's Joanna's interview. Well, hello, Joanna. Welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, Liz. Thanks for having me back.
When I first interviewed you on the podcast, it was about your paper a couple of years ago when you suggest there wasn't a link between a serotonin imbalance in the brain and depression. And your new book really explores this in more depth and how that belief started many decades before. But I think even today, some psychiatrists and doctors would still argue that the hypothesis hasn't been disproved.
Well, it's impossible to prove a negative. You don't ever definitively show that something is disproved. You just can show that there isn't positive evidence for it. So that's what we showed in our paper. Wasn't much positive evidence for it, that the evidence is weak, is inconsistent. And I think that, most people agree with that position.
Because, in fact, a follow-up paper that was published in the same journal as your review paper said, and I quote, "We present reasons for why this conclusion is overstated, including methodological weaknesses in the review process, selective reporting of data, oversimplification, and errors in the interpretation of neuropsychopharmacological findings." And they actually demanded a retracting of the paper, which is something which is usually only done in the case of major mistakes or indeed fraud.
As far as I know, they didn't demand that officially to the journal. Some people mentioned it to newspapers or on Twitter. We did a comprehensive response to their criticisms. I am confident that we did a very good quality review. One of the members of our team worked as a systematic reviewer. That was her special role in a team that did systematic reviews. We followed protocols, we followed Cochrane guidance, and we modelled our review on several other quite well-known systematic umbrella reviews that this group cited. So I'm confident. You can always have different opinions about how a review is done. That's always going to happen, and some people might say it's better to do it like this or to do it like that. So that can always happen. But I'm confident that we did a good job, that we justified everything that we did, and that we were transparent about everything that we did.
What is it about psychiatry that generates such a vitriolic debate? Because certainly if you look on Twitter, and really it does feel like there are two sides now. I don't know which other way to describe it. People who remain convinced that the current psychological medications we have are incredibly important, and people like you who are deeply sceptical. And I'm always quite taken aback by just how rude people are.
Yeah, it is extraordinary, isn't it? I agree. It seems very polarised, the discussion on Twitter in particular, but in other places too. I think the fundamental problem is that many psychiatrists, not all, but many psychiatrists want to portray themselves or portray their specialty, portray psychiatry as being the same as medicine. So therefore they want to make the point that psychological problems are essentially the same as bodily or physical problems. So having depression is the same sort of thing as having pneumonia. And I don't think that's true. And many people, ever since psychiatry has been a specialty, have disagreed with that position. And some of the people that disagree are people who have been patients of psychiatrists and who feel that their difficulties have been wrongly medicalized and that they've been wrongly medicated. Some of the people on Twitter today are people who've taken medication for psychiatric problems in good faith, signed up to the psychiatric model, and then found that that medication has given them really significant and severe problems, and then found, on top of that, that their complaints about the medication have been dismissed or turned round into, this is just part of your psychological problem. And so, understandably, I think, they're angry about that. Then psychiatrists feel that they're being attacked because their treatments are being criticised, and then they get defensive, and then you get this very polarised debate that you see.
And I suppose you belong to something called the Critical Psychiatry Network. So your critics will say your review in 2022 is a product of your own prejudices.
And I would say that, everything we produce in science and everywhere else is a product of prejudices to some extent. But then obviously we can do some things to limit how much those prejudices affect things. I mean, I would say that a lot of psychiatric research, probably the majority of it nowadays, is the product of unexamined assumptions and prejudices that psychological problems, mental health problems are biological problems like pneumonia. Because people just think that's how it is. They don't bother to examine their assumptions. I constantly have to examine my assumptions because I am constantly, all the time, challenged about them.
You're a tenured professor, so you have some job security. In a way, it seems to me that medicine has found criticism harder in recent years. Do you think if you were starting out in your career now, it would be as easy for you to speak out as you have?
So I think that when I was starting out in psychiatry, there was more debate and discussion about the nature of mental illness, about whether or not it was appropriate or useful to view it as a biological condition. There was the psychoanalytic understanding of mental health problems, which I don't necessarily sign up to altogether, but that was very influential. It encouraged a sort of non-biological way of looking at things, of understanding how our current troubles may be related to previous problems and experiences. I think the level of debate on these fundamental issues has shrunk over the last few decades as neuroscience has become more and more prominent, more and more sexy, as people seem to believe neuroscientific pronouncements that motivation is related to dopamine, which no one has shown, that more serotonin makes you happy, which again we haven't shown. There are frequent claims of these sorts. They're just made so frequently they've become part of the culture, and people don't realise that actually these claims are going way, way beyond the evidence base. And so we've really come to think more and more in terms of our psychological life being rooted in our brain chemistry and our brain structure and functioning, rather than in the circumstances of our lives. But as I say, I think even in psychiatry a couple of decades ago, there was much more of that way of thinking and much more debate.
And interestingly, while you're paper gained attention across the media, there does seem to have been a bit of a difference across the political divide in terms of how it was received between centre and centre-left publications and the more right-wing media.
Yes, so this was very surprising to me. The critics of over-medicalisation who started writing in the 60s and 70s were usually on the left of the political spectrum. And that was partly because they were criticising the medical establishment and the pharmaceutical industry, which has been the prerogative of the left generally. For various reasons, and I don't claim to understand them fully, the left have moved away from that position and embraced or become closer to the idea of medicalising various forms of unhappiness and suffering. And it's the right that have started to question that position.
And it's interesting because your politics are naturally to the left yourself.
Yes, exactly. So it was quite strange to me when I started to realise that the serotonin paper and its implications were being picked up by the right much more than the left-wing media. And, left-wing publication Rolling Stone did a hit job on me to try and discredit me, and partly by trying to associate me with the right-wing people who had spoken about our paper, or who had previously criticised antidepressants in one way or another.
Joanna, do you think that's because the left sometimes comes from a more authoritarian perspective?
I think that's partly it, but I think it also comes from a well-meaning place that the left media are trying to not to stigmatise people and not to associate mental health labels with stigma. So they're trying to encourage people to embrace the idea of having mental health problems rather than to try and reframe their problems in another way, which might be another way of approaching it.
See, my experience is this wouldn't just apply to drugs for depression and mental illnesses. For whatever reason, and I think there has been a big change, I think the left is, generally speaking, less sceptical of big pharma now than the right across a number of medical issues. So if you want to look at reports of side effects from the drugs, problems from the drugs, generally speaking now, they tend to come from the right-wing media.
Yes, I mean, that's true, isn't it? The right wing have become more suspicious of experts, and I suppose that has happened as the establishment has become more centre-left. The right has then taken up the position of being sceptical and suspicious of the establishment and its experts.
And I'm sure a decade ago, you would have been surprised if I'd said, and the Tucker Carlson show on Fox actually did a pretty accurate piece on your work.
I would have been flabbergasted. And I watched the programme with trepidation and then was really pleasantly surprised. I thought it was a very reasonable programme that asked some very important questions about the pharmaceutical industry and how they have shaped our way of thinking about various difficulties, including mental health problems.
Now, I don't want to make you sound like a conspiracy theorist, but in your book, you mentioned that you were invited on the BBC Today programme and then uninvited. The discussion that took place on ITV's This Morning programme never appeared as an official clip. The New York Times, after commissioning an article, decided to drop it. Are you suggesting that's all part of this same sort of political process?
Well, it might be, Liz, is what I'm suggesting. The only one that I know that it was highly suspicious was the New York Times article where the reporter had been commissioned and written the article and then it was withdrawn at the last minute.
The other interesting thing is you say that the medical press, you believe, gave more coverage to the paper that attacked your review than they did to your original paper.
Yes, so I noticed that the British Medical Journal, which covered our review in just a small paragraph, devoted a whole page to the paper that attacked us and tried to discredit our paper, and didn't even give us a right of reply until I complained to the editor, and he then did to his credit immediately rectify that and make the journalist rewrite it and insert my response.
Which is interesting because the BMJ receives less pharmaceutical funding, and I don't know if that's a factor or not, which tends to be actually more critical of industry.
The British Medical Journal has been a fantastic cheerleader in separating medicine from the pharmaceutical industry and really criticising the conflict of interest that has existed. back in the noughties, the British Medical Journal was really leading an anti-pharmaceutical industry influence campaign. I don't know that it's necessarily pulled back on that. I think that it still does a lot of really good work. But I think it just illustrates how nervous doctors are at criticising established treatments, and particularly antidepressants for various reasons. I think doctors feel quite exposed without having antidepressants. If they have to acknowledge that these drugs are really pretty useless and quite harmful, how on earth else are they going to deal with someone who comes into their office very distressed? Fact is that because we've been medicalising depression for years and years, people now go to their doctor and expect the doctor to offer them some sort of solution. And of course, most of the time the doctor can't, but by handing over a prescription for an antidepressant, it looks as if they are doing something about it and trying to help people.
But from your perspective, if depression isn't a biological imbalance, then we need to rethink our entire approach to depression and even what we mean by the word.
Absolutely. People say, how else would you treat depression? And I say, well, the first thing is to stop thinking of it as a thing that is the same in everyone who has it. All these terms are questionable. Depression is a sort of emotion or a mood, which are by definition the ways that human beings react to things that are going on in their environment, coloured by the experiences they've had in the past that make them the person who they are. And that's how we need to understand depression. We need to ask, what's happening in this person's life and what has happened to them in the past that makes them react in this particular way, and how can we help them to address that? No single alternative way of approaching depression if you look at it like that. But just to say that doesn't mean that drugs don't affect people's emotions. Drugs do affect people's emotions, and antidepressants seem to have this numbing effect or restricting effect on people's feelings. So people often report, that they didn't really feel sad or happy while they were on their antidepressants. And it's very typical when people come off antidepressants that they become very tearful, a rebound reaction. They become over-emotional because the emotions have been damped down while they were taking the drug. So drugs do affect our mental states. We know with alcohol, it profoundly changes how we feel about things and how we think. But that's a very different prospect from them treating an underlying biological condition. And one of the points I try to make in my book, because I think it's interesting looking at it historically, is that when people were surveyed back in the early 1990s about how they thought about depression and antidepressants, most people felt that depression was an emotional reaction to things like divorce or unemployment. So exactly the sort of model that I was suggesting just now. And people felt that taking a drug for depression would just numb them or cloud their minds in some ways, so that people were reluctant to take antidepressants. These surveys were done as part of a campaign to overcome these views, to overcome people's resistance to taking drugs for depression, and to persuade them that no, depression was in fact a chemical imbalance and the drugs weren't just clouding your mind, they were rectifying this underlying problem. So there is a different way to think about depression. We don't have to think of it as a brain problem, which is not to say there aren't things going on in your brain when you're depressed. Of course there are, but that doesn't mean they're the cause of your feelings, or that they are targeted and rectified by the drugs that we use.
And the survey you mentioned was partly funded by the pharmaceutical industry.
It was, because it was part of the Defeat Depression campaign, which was partly funded by Eli Lilly, who are the makers of Prozac, the first big SSRI antidepressant.
So the common group of drugs that people take for depression, the SSRIs, they are actually increasing the serotonin levels in our brain, although there is now little evidence that that's going to be useful.
Well, actually, we're not sure quite what they do to the brain, particularly in the long term. So they probably boost serotonin levels in the short term. But as I say, because we don't know that serotonin is linked with depression, we've no idea really what that does to mood. In fact, the only thing we reliably know about serotonin is that it's bad for your sex life, that it suppresses your sex drive and interferes with sexual function in various ways. That's the most robust research on serotonin is on its deleterious effect on sexual functioning. Otherwise, what it does is really very unclear. Although antidepressants may boost serotonin initially or increase levels of serotonin initially, there's a little bit of evidence that people who take them long-term might even have lower levels of serotonin. It's just very unclear, actually.
I'm interested that you're saying about serotonin affecting sexual function, because one thing we do know about the SSRI drugs are the various problems that they create with sexual function, both for people while they're taking the drugs and for some very unfortunate people, even after they come off the drugs.
Yes, absolutely. I think this is a really under-recognised problem and something that worries me a lot, given that more and more young people in particular are going on antidepressants because of the encouragement to embrace medical labels and medical solutions that is coming from a lot of the media that we referred to earlier. Lots of young people are going on antidepressants, and we don't know how common this persistent sexual dysfunction is that some people experience when they've stopped them. There's a little bit of research that suggests that, maybe it's 1 in 200 people, which isn't very common, but given the numbers of people who are taking these drugs, that still adds up to a significant number of people. And, that may well be an underestimate as well. So that is a very worrying aspect of our mass use of antidepressants, and one of the reasons why I want to get the message out that we need to rethink antidepressants as a treatment.
I remember one academic suggesting to me that different psychiatrists have different favoured diagnoses. So whereas if I go to a cardiologist with a heart condition, if they're competent, hopefully they'll both come up with a similar diagnosis. But if I go in to see 2 different psychiatrists, if they come from different schools of thought, I may come out with 2 different diagnoses.
If we acknowledge that what psychiatric diagnosis is the description of various patterns of behaviour, it's then understandable that there will be disagreement. Some people will think, well, these behaviours you've just told me, these problems you've got seem to me to fit with this label best, and another person might think they fit with another label best. So I don't think it should surprise anyone that happens if they understood the real nature of psychiatric diagnosis. But because people think it is and should be like diagnosis in medicine, then it's a surprise.
So how did we get into this state? Because if you look back at the history of drugs to treat depression, early on we've got barbiturates and amphetamines. How did we get to the point that we thought chemical imbalance is what was going on?
Yeah, so very good question. So as you point out, people have used mind-changing drugs of one sort or another, those that people obtain illicitly through a dealer, all those that are prescribed to manage unhappiness and difficult mental states for a very long time. And these drugs have come in one form or another. And in the middle part of the 20th century, a lot of people were using barbiturates and then benzodiazepines to manage unwanted feelings, which at that time were generally labelled anxiety. When the benzodiazepines came in the 1960s, they were promoted as being a non-addictive, safe alternative to barbiturates. They were safer because barbiturates are very dangerous drugs that can kill people easily, and benzodiazepines are safer in that respect. But they were not less addictive. They were also addictive in the sense that people became physically dependent on them, developed withdrawal symptoms when they stopped them. And some people also became addicts in the sense of enjoying their effects and wanting to get higher doses. But lots of people didn't become addicts in that sense, but just became physically dependent on them.
Because there's a difference between addiction and dependence, and they often get muddled.
Yes, it's a bit semantic, which is why I try and explain the terms, but some people use the term dependence specifically to talk about the physiological dependence and the withdrawals you get, the physiological withdrawal symptoms you get, and some people use the term addiction to refer to addict-type behaviour, of drug-seeking type behaviour. But a lot of people use the terms interchangeably, so it's important, I think, to specify how they're being used. But the point was that in the 1980s, it became apparent that the benzodiazepines were just as addictive, just as dependence-forming and addictive as the barbiturates had been, and that lots of people were experiencing real difficulty coming off them, having really severe withdrawal symptoms, and also that they had been just doled out really to people to keep people quiet, particularly women who were unhappy and dissatisfied with their lives. So it became a big scandal, the mass prescribing of benzodiazepines. And so this is when the idea of the chemical imbalance was really recruited.
It's in 1965 that a scientist introduces the idea.
So first ideas about depression being related to chemical imbalances in the brain are articulated in the 1960s by various psychiatrists and researchers in the literature. And psychiatry continues to show some interest in that, and there's a big research project set up to see whether there are any abnormalities in brain chemicals, including serotonin, but also noradrenaline, which was one of the main chemicals of interest at that time in the 1980s, which never report that they find anything. They don't really report that they don't find anything either, but I'm guessing that if they did, they would have reported it. That was a big American government-funded project that was set up then. So there was interest in psychiatry, but it wasn't a sort of widely known idea. And so it didn't become cultural concept until the pharmaceutical industry recruited it.
And Prozac is launched, which is the first SSRI, and becomes, I think, the second best-selling drug in the US. And you say it becomes a sort of cultural, not just a medical phenomenon.
Yes, so Peter Kramer writes his famous book, Listening to Prozac. Elizabeth Wurtzel writes a book, Prozac Nation. So several books are written about it. Elizabeth Wurtzel's book is made into a film. It's splashed on the front cover of Time magazine and various other well-known magazines. So the culture is saturated with this idea that there's this wonderful new antidepressant that's going to dramatically cure people of their unhappiness and depression. Peter Kramer's book talks about people having complete personality changes, being better than well. There's lots and lots of hype around it. You know, over the next few years, it becomes apparent that these drugs do nothing of the sort, have much more subtle, if any, effects.
What's interesting is it's not just prescribed for depression, but quickly for a range of illnesses. What was the medical evidence for expanding that?
So I'm not sure how much medical evidence there was. Yeah, I'm not sure. Some of the new indications that come on board, such as social anxiety disorder, that's widely publicised, probably in the early noughties. And of course, it's recommended for premenstrual tension, premenstrual dysphoric disorder. It's relabeled, renamed. It's always quite widely prescribed for anxiety, but of course that goes along with depression, so it's not necessarily a sort of completely different indication.
And of course it was stressed that this new class of drugs wouldn't cause dependence, which of course we now know not to be the case.
Yes, it was. The story is very similar to the benzodiazepines in that respect. Lots of information and educational campaigns to persuade people that these drugs were not addictive. They're not drugs that people will go out and buy on street corners, but nevertheless, they are drugs that make people physically dependent on them. Some of them can cause really nasty, severe, and debilitating withdrawal symptoms when people come off them.
And what's interesting in the 90s when these drugs start to be introduced is the staggering increase. I mean, you say, I think, 235% increase in the UK, 1,550% in the US.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I think a reflection of how successful that publicity campaign was. Even before the US lifted its ban on direct-to-consumer advertising, which was lifted in about 1997, I believe, 1996 or 1997. And after that, television commercials came along. SSRIs were directly advertised to consumers after that. But even before that, the pharmaceutical industry were managing to get to the general public in various ways, like placing inserts in magazines.
But the big question I always have when I look at the data for the efficacy of these drugs is how did they become so popular so quickly when the trial data was, to put it mildly, less than convincing?
I mean, that's a good question. I think it is testimony to two things: the power of advertising, the extent of that advertising campaign, which was phenomenal.
I mean, I can understand that, Joanna, from the public's perspective. But on average, what these trials show is around a 2-point difference in something called a Hamilton score. A Hamilton score is a survey used to assess depression, typically out of 50 points. And generally speaking, 2 points is considered too small to be clinically noticeable.
Yes, so the difference between antidepressants and a placebo in clinical trials is minimal, probably below the level that anyone would even notice or that would ever have any impact on anyone's life. Moreover, it's not certain that it's due to a pharmacological effect anyway. In my view, there's quite a lot of evidence that it's probably due to amplified placebo effects, because people can often detect whether they're getting the real drug or the placebo, and the people who get the real drug think, oh, great, I'm getting the real thing. The people who are taking the placebo are disappointed. And we know that people's expectations about what they get have a profound influence on their outcomes, that they can cause a difference in Hamilton scales of 5 or 6 points, much larger than the difference that you see between an actual antidepressant and a placebo.
And this is because a lot of people in these trials will have taken these drugs before, or drugs in this class before, so they might recognise side effects such as dry mouth, for example.
So they might recognise side effects because they've been on the drugs before. Some of these drugs have fairly subtle side effects, which aren't too noticeable, but some of them have really very noticeable side effects. The old tricyclic antidepressants have very noticeable side effects. They cause quite profound sedation as well as a dry mouth. You know, some people will notice the side effects even if they haven't tried them before. So yes, so I think that explains the small difference that you see, which is probably not clinically relevant anyway. It's a really good question. Why do such ineffective drugs become such huge bestsellers? And as I say, I think the answer is partly advertising, but also I think it just shows how appealing the idea is for a simple treatment for a complex situation. We'd all love it to be the case, wouldn't we? If we could just take a pill and it would get rid of all our problems. I mean, yeah, fantastic. But sadly, life's not like that.
We like to sort of put Western medicine on a bit of a pedestal, that it's evidence-based. We do the trials and we look for solid data that the drug works. We'd be very sceptical of an alternative practitioner who said, but I know my treatment works. But I've heard very experienced psychiatrists make exactly that argument about antidepressants.
Absolutely, all the time. Very authoritative statements that antidepressants are useful, do work, prevent suicide, all these things without backing it up with evidence necessarily. Doctors seem to feel that they have the right to make these authoritative statements, even in this age of evidence-based medicine.
And the other argument that is sometimes made is the drugs aren't very effective for moderate depression, but they are more effective for severe depression.
Yeah, so there's a little bit of evidence that they are slightly more effective for severe depression. It's not completely consistent. Some studies don't find that, but some do. But the effects for severe depression are still very minimal. And the difference between severe and mild depression is not large either.
And on average, how long do people take these drugs for?
So a lot of people take them for a few weeks. But if you take everyone who's taking antidepressants today in the UK, about 50% of them will have been taking them for longer than a year.
Which is interesting because when you look at the studies, typically the drug trials only run for 8 weeks or so.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a really big problem, that we don't have very much evidence about the pros and cons of taking antidepressants for long periods of time, as many people do. So we don't have good evidence about whether there are any benefits, but also we don't have good evidence about all the potential harmful effects that might be associated with taking them long term. That's why things like persistent sexual dysfunction and these severe withdrawal reactions that many people get have come out so late in the day. And I think only really since we've had the internet and people have been able to connect and work out what might be happening to them. I mean, it's awful to think of what it must have been like before then, when people, may have stopped an antidepressant, suddenly got a really nasty withdrawal reaction and were just sitting there wondering what on earth was going on, what on earth had hit them. And their doctor probably had no idea. But now, thank goodness, we are more linked up. But it's still the case that people in this situation are turning to other people who've had the experience and websites and organisations set up by patients themselves rather than by doctors or researchers or academics because there's still so little interest in these harmful effects.
I know when I interviewed your colleague, Dr. Mark Horowitz, who was taking antidepressants himself, talking about how he found the best advice from an IT engineer on the web. And that was someone who you would have hoped would have had access to useful knowledge.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's extraordinary, isn't it, that a doctor is turning to random people on the internet to try and get their information about what to do about their withdrawal symptoms.
And one thing that does puzzle me is if there's not any sort of biological explanation for depression, how does that explain the developing area of psychiatry called metabolic psychiatry? A group of psychiatrists are using ketogenic diets to treat a range of mental illness, and clearly the work's at an early stage, but they do seem to be having some early positive results, which might suggest that diet, say, has some impact on brain chemistry. So I asked Dr. Georgia Eade about this, who's been on the podcast a couple of times, and this is what she said. The serotonin deficit hypothesis of depression is dying a long overdue death, and serogenic medications bring far too little relief to far too few patients. Presently, one of the most promising new treatments for depression would seem to be the ketogenic diet, which in uncontrolled trials has been associated with dramatic improvements in depression symptom scores in a large percentage of participants. So, while neurotransmitter systems, including those that involve serotonin, may indeed play some role in depression, and the ketogenic diet does influence these systems, other mechanisms figure much more prominently in the development of depression, most notably neuroinflammation, oxidative stress, insulin resistance, and mitochondrial dysfunction. So I'm just interested in your thoughts on that.
So I am reluctant to replace the serotonin hypothesis with other biological hypotheses. This is what a lot of psychiatrists have tried to do since we published the paper in order to keep the biological bandwagon rolling. And inflammation has been one of the favoured candidates. Neurogeneration and synaptogenesis has been another one. There's no good or consistent or strong evidence for any of these, just as there isn't for the serotonin hypothesis. There's probably less.
It's obviously emerging work and clearly difficult to double blind in the case where you're using a dietary solution. But just in looking in terms of studies that they have done, I've got a couple of studies in front of me here that showed clearly clinically noticeable levels of improvement in their Hamilton scores for a group of patients in a study that was published in 2022. So I suppose where I would say there's a difference is it's one thing having an hypothesis, but if you're getting solid results, and there are a number of patients now, in the same way that an awful lot of the dietary work with diabetes was patient-led, I think that is also happening with this as well. There are a number of practitioners involved in this, from Stanford to in Edinburgh, but also actually patients thinking, well, what have I got to lose?
So it makes me think about the fact that exercise is helpful for people with depression. And I would speculate that that's for a couple of reasons. Firstly, I think it has a psychological impact. It helps people to feel better about themselves. It gets people out and gets them active, and that may, counteract the sort of social withdrawal that often goes along with depression. But also there's a way in which exercise actually makes us feel physically better, whether that's due to endorphins or, whatever the physiological basis of it is. It makes us feel physically better. And a lot of people with depression are overweight, so a diet that helps them to lose weight will help them feel better about themselves and may also just help them to feel healthier and better as well. So, I think there are those ways in which it may help people with depression. SSRIs, of course, generally tend to make people put on a bit of weight. Some antidepressants make people put on a lot of weight. Generally not good for people's self-esteem. I think interventions that make people feel better about themselves and in a psychological way, and also may make people feel a bit better physically, like exercise, are useful potentially.
If you look at the history of ketogenic diets for epilepsy, the Johns Hopkins Hospital has pretty strong track record in doing that for patients since the 1920s. And certainly in children for whom drugs don't work, it's now used a lot. And the epilepsy drugs are some of the same as the drugs that are used for bipolar. So is it not therefore possible there might be some sort of similar mechanism going on?
I'm sorry, I don't know enough about it to comment, Liz. I'd want to look at the research on the ketogenic diet and epilepsy in detail to be convinced.
Okay. I'll send you the links after the show anyway, and I'll be interested to know what you think.
Okay, thank you.
We were talking about the sexual side effects of the drug. And in fact, you say that the animal studies too have shown that there definitely is an effect here.
Yes, absolutely. The animal studies show that there's an effect, well, not only while animals are taking the drugs, but after they've stopped them. There are several animal studies showing that there are persistent effects on animal sexual function and sexual activity.
And also actually on fertility, which given the number of young men and women that now take the drugs is potentially a concern.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, there are effects on fertility as well.
And it's interesting because you mentioned a guide for London GPs, which talks about the risks of not treating depression, but doesn't give the same emphasis, you argue, to potential side effects.
That's the guide to treating depression in pregnancy, isn't it?
Yes.
There's been a lot of education aimed at doctors telling them not to be worried about treating pregnant women with antidepressants, which I think has been very irresponsible, given that we know that actually antidepressants have a number of proven effects, adverse effects on the fetus and, on the newborn babies. Basically, newborn babies come out with a version of a withdrawal syndrome.
If you're not giving a pregnant woman the full picture, how does that fit in with the medical idea of informed consent?
Well, it's not just pregnant women who I don't think get enough information to give informed consent to antidepressants. I imagine it's most people, because if they're not told explicitly that depression is a chemical imbalance or some sort of biological abnormality and the drug's going to rectify it, that is what is implied, because doctors don't generally understand antidepressants as drugs that change the normal state of the brain or explain that to patients, which in my view they should. And they don't explain to patients that actually don't have good evidence that there is a biological abnormality or that the drugs are targeting this or rectifying this. What we know is that these are drugs that modify the normal state of the brain in some ways. We don't know all the full consequences of that, but there do seem to be some adverse effects. And, usually there are when you mess about with brain chemistry. And unless people are given that sort of information, I don't think they're really able to make a proper informed decision about whether to take antidepressants or not.
Because from what I hear now, it's less that people get told about a chemical imbalance, but when they are prescribed these drugs, they're often not given a full picture on what the potential side effects are.
Yeah, if you just don't say anything about how antidepressants work, people will assume in today's culture that they are targeting a chemical imbalance or targeting something. Very few people are going to understand actually what they are. I hope that people are now being told about the problem of withdrawal symptoms, because there has been a lot more publicity about that. But I suspect that people are still not being told about the possibility of persistent sexual dysfunction, or that most people are not being informed about that possibility, because I think that's still not widely acknowledged.
What do you think is the value of psychiatry as a discipline of medicine?
Well, there are people who develop psychiatric problems like psychotic symptoms that really fundamentally affect their ability to function and sometimes make them dangerous. And I think there needs to be a profession or a team of professions that provide help and support for people in those situations. For people with depression and anxiety, which is most always related to things that are going on in their lives, I would suggest that the right place for them to get help is probably within social work or within social services rather than within medicine. So I think some of what psychiatrists do at the moment has some value. Some of it, I think, needs to be rethought and approached in a different way from a different institutional base.
So you're saying we need less psychiatrists?
Yes, probably. That won't go down well with the Royal College.
But before I put you out of work, if I make you health secretary tomorrow and you can have complete control, you can do whatever you want to the NHS, what are you going to do?
I would set up services for people with mental health problems in social services and departments of social work, and staff them mainly with social workers and allied professions. And I would make efforts to get GPs and doctors to divert people to these services. So some of this is happening in some way with the social prescribing initiative. So I think it is recognised that a lot of what goes to general practitioners consists of social problems. But the trouble is, there isn't anywhere else for people to go. And I think we need to have somewhere for people to go who are distressed, who are struggling to cope with various difficulties in their lives. But I don't think that should be a medical place.
And on that controversial note, thank you very much, Joanna, for talking today.
Thank you, Liz. Nice to talk again.
Bye-bye. Hope you enjoyed the latest episode of the podcast. And if you've enjoyed the podcast, if you could share it and leave a review on Spotify and Apple, I'd much appreciate it. It really helps. Many thanks for listening. Bye for now.